Episode 41 of the World Builder's Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram, and today's topic is tax attack. Don't know where to start building your fantasy world? Do you need more? Does it make sense? Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination. This is the place that will help prime your mind. Now, it's time to heat up the forge, break out the mithril ingots and hammer. Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil. I'm your host, Jeffrey W. Ingram. Let's sup from the mug of Java and build. Welcome back to this episode, and I want to thank you once again for listening to the World Builder's Anvil. And this is not an episode about are taxes good or bad. That is for you and the cultures in your world to divine. What I'll be doing in today's episode is talking about the different kinds of taxation that governments can have and why it's important. And to lead off with why it's important, you have to understand that governments need to support themselves. Governments, unless they own all of the property in the state, do not own everything. And if they don't own everything, they need a way to make money so that they can provide the security and the services that the state is doing for the people who live under it. And the way I look at taxes is in two ways. There is direct taxation and then there is indirect taxation. And you could probably argue some of these that I say are direct are really indirect and vice versa. The way I define it is anything that's a direct tax is something where you are directly giving the money to the government, and indirect taxes is going through a third party. And sometimes over time, certain things that are direct taxes might end up as indirect taxes. However, not always. So let's go through, and I'm not going to give a huge definition of each of these, just a basic idea. And you need to know these things for your state because wherever you're taking something from people, no matter what the intention, it is an area of potential conflict, potential discussions that can happen in the background where people are arguing over the validity of a tax, where people are sick of paying too much taxes, where they feel robbed because they're paying too much taxes. However you want to take it. Knowing the tax structure, not completely. You don't want to know the IRS rules if you're in the United States, but I want to know that the IRS controls income tax. And if they have special authorities to do it, what they are. And if the state has special agents that gather it, you might want to know who they are. Usually tax collectors are not looked at in a positive light, which is one of the reasons for the popularity of indirect taxes, because someone else does the collection for the government and you either don't notice or you don't think about the taxes you're paying quite as much. I guess that's what it is. Direct taxes and duties. Property tax, you pay for the land you live on. Income tax, you pay money based on the income you earn. Statutory labor. This is a big one, especially if you remember early on in cultures and in states, money will be more scarce. Especially if they're minting money, it will be more scarce. So a lot of times the way you pay is in statutory labor. So I have a field of an acre, let's say, of crops. And I have to give, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever percentage of the spoils of my land, whether it be corn or rice or soybeans or whatever I'm growing, or potentially a certain percentage of my livestock that I've gained that year, and give those things directly to the Lord in lieu of money because I'm too poor to give him money. And so instead of money, I must provide him food or potentially things that will help strengthen the state. So if I'm a miner, maybe it's ore. If I'm a blacksmith, maybe it's weapons. It can be anything, but if it's statutory labor, it is based off of the labor of the person providing, not off of money. Salt tax. And this is kind of a specific one I give because it's very popular in history. Salt is used to preserve food. And before refrigerators are a way to preserve food without salt, salt was one of the main ways you did that. So early on, salt was another way you could pay taxes in lieu of money. And you maybe didn't even have to earn it, but if you could afford salt, you could give salt in lieu of coin. And whether or not the state will allow that is up to you. However, it's a good thing to keep in mind. And later on, salt tax also sort of becomes this idea of referring to if there's a good so important to the state that they want to make sure that no individual creates too much scarcity, they will create what is called a salt tax on it, whether it be oil or salt. If it's considered really valuable, they might tax it, because taxing things makes people's ability to buy them, gives people less ability to buy them because they artificially cost more money. So a salt tax is sort of a dual. It could be statutory labor if someone's a salt miner, but it's usually not that, because salt mines usually need specific criteria to be created about. Tenure tax. I have tenure on land. And no, this is not for professors, it's for peasants. So later on, as economies start to grow, maybe I start earning coin as a peasant. And then instead of paying in labor and in crops strictly to the Lord, I'm giving cash to them. You can kind of think about it like rent, because the Lord owns the land. So I'm a renter on the land. So I pay a tenure tax to tithe. A tithe is kind of like the same thing, but it's from a lord to a higher lord. I will pay him for the right of me being this lord. Tariffs. Tariffs are, you are trying to ship goods into my country, so I make you pay me a tax to allow them to come in. Tribute is, I go to your country, I threaten war or I commit war on you, and you start paying me tribute to stop invading. So it's sort of like taxing the foreigners. I think Mike Python had a good joke. Inheritance tax. You die, I get 0 to 100% of your wealth. And so instead of going to your children, it goes to me, and I do with it as I see fit as the leader of your country. Excise tax. Excise tax you think of on cars and on things that people consider luxury goods. I don't think that happened so much really long ago. In ancient times, I don't think there were excise taxes. I think that's more when you start getting more plenty, more prosperity. It's a different way for the government to increase revenue. Tolls, if done correctly, the idea is I want to build a road, I put a toll up, I use the tolls to pay for the construction of the road, to pay me back for the construction of the road. Oftentimes they don't go away when the construction's done, or sometimes they partially go away, like in Western Massachusetts, and then they bring it back, like in Western Massachusetts. Now, tolls might be bad taxation too. I think it's a common tactic for bandits to use to be like, I'm here to collect a toll because you're on the King's Road. Give me money. And whether or not actual tax collector is it's an interesting, maybe common sort of idea, especially in periods of time where it's harder for the government to police its own state. Marriage tax. This is an interesting one I found. I believe the Ottomans were most known for it. But it's the idea of, you want to get married, you pay me coin gets you married. Because typically marriage is usually considered a business contract, a contract between two individuals. It's more of a modern idea that marriage is a religious thing. I mean, it used to be. It kind of lost that flair when Christianity came around, because the whole religious marriage context was a pagan thing. And there's some battle to whether or not people should even get married really early on in Christianity. And then the people who said that marriage is wrong ended up losing out, and I think became considered heresy in Christianity. But it really wasn't probably until the 15th or 16th century, somewhere around there, where church marriages started coming about again. So it's always been this idea of two people who cohabitate, usually of different genders, together to raise families. If you live like you're married, and even well past the time church weddings happened, this idea of what they call common law marriage, which is if I live with my wife and we don't get the paperwork filled out by the government, after a certain period of time, they just consider us married either way. Even in the U.S., that existed probably, I think, until the mid-1800s, and then it went away. And now you have to get a license by the state, but some states tax the license. Or they might have a fee for it either way, but to me, if the fee is really paying processing the paperwork, I guess it's not really a tax, but it really is. If they use it for other things, or they just use it as a way to gather revenue, it's really a tax at that point. Minority tax. This is something too, the Ottomans, I believe, did it with rabbis. You could do anything within a state and say, if you're this kind of person, you must pay extra money because you're that kind of person. Once again, I'm not arguing the validity, the good or bad of this. That's just what it is. Now, indirect taxes, sales tax. I require all businesses to gather money for me if you buy goods from them. If they don't, I punish them. It's a way for me to distance myself from the taxes being levied. And it's also, I have less people I have to punish if I don't get the money I'm supposed to get. Value added tax. Kind of the same idea as a sales tax, but a little bit different. Essentially, it's usually every level of the creation of a good to the final sale of the good supposedly adds value to a product. And at every level, there's a taxation. And so you end up paying this extra percentage at the end. And it's kind of like a sales tax, but not exactly. Because it's layered in. It's kind of complicated. Goods and services tax. Once again, it's kind of the same idea, if I understand it correctly, as a sales tax, but it's on goods and services instead of just the sale of goods. You want to know, I've listed here called use tax, which is if I go somewhere else and I buy stuff where they don't gather sales tax for my state wants me to pay it anyway, so I have to pay use tax. It's called use tax if you don't use it when you're there. If you bring it back to use in the state where there's the sales tax, that's usually my understanding, but I'm not a CPA, you have to ask my wife. Inflation. Inflation, some people call it the hidden tax, and some people don't even call it a tax. But when the government makes money, if they devalue the money, it gives them more spending power when they make the next round. They're usually at the front end of it, spilling the money out into the economy. So they get the goods and services at the lower price, but they end up driving up the prices of the goods and services for everyone because the amount of money you have is worth just a little bit less. And it usually doesn't happen really quickly. It's usually over time it builds up and it builds up. If it happens really quickly, you can go to this thing called hyperinflation, which you can't miss because the value of the currency becomes worth almost nothing if it gets really bad. Subsidy, that's another sort of hidden one. That's where I take money from the other parts of the economy and give it to a specific part and choose the subsidy of your distaste. But essentially, I am, as the government, trying to influence the sector of the economy by giving them something from other people. And that's really all it is. It's indirect tax because it really comes from other parts of the economy because, once again, the government does not create wealth out of nothing. They have to tax it to get it. So if they tax it and then give it away, the subsidy is really an indirect taxation. However, that's maybe kind of a lousy one to put here too as I'm thinking about it because in a way it's going to come probably through a form of direct or indirect taxes. However, I could throw a fee to make you buy cell phones for other people when you buy a cell phone. That would really be a subsidy tax. Corporate tax. And this is what people might argue with me on. They say that's not indirect taxation because the corporations should pay tax too. But ultimately, the corporations, much like the government, are just a group of people who are doing things in common for common purpose. Ergo, they don't really exist as people. And since they don't exist as people, the people who buy the goods are the only ones who have the money to pay the tax. So if it costs me $40 to make something and $20 of that is tax, I'm going to charge at least $40, if not more, or go out of business. So I'm forced to pass the cost along to the customer, and they are indirectly paying for it. If I don't pass it on, I'm really taking it from the owners of the company, who are a different group of people. Maybe they don't have the ability to share it out the same way. However, if they do, it is really an indirect tax. And I want to give special thanks to Entrepreneurs Library and Ray Rose with WC Talk Radio for some great reviews on iTunes. And for everyone else out there, please subscribe, rate, and review my show in iTunes. The rating for this episode is intermediate. You don't need to know this, but I think it adds a layer of detail and complexity into society that a lot of people don't think much about. And a lot of strife can be caused upon it too if the farmers are being subsidized by the state off the miners are going to resent the farmers. Or the government might be resented because they're the ones who are doing the taking. Or the entities who they've indirectly tapped to take you will be presented. The world building task for the day: figure out how your fictional fantasy government gets its money to operate. And don't waste your life on this. And like I said, you don't need all the rules and regulations, but you want to know the basics of how do they get their money, because it might have impact on the way you tell stories. It might add dialogue or take away from dialogue. And I'm not saying make books about taxes, that would be boring. But you might have intrigue because there's a lot of money in taxes and people trying to steal the tax money, or people trying to commit fraud for the tax money. There are a lot of angles, a lot of stories that happen in the real world. Some are very interesting, and taxes end up being the back of that. The real world task for the day: make a list of all the taxes you pay and say, do those fit into what I'm talking about? And see if you can find inspiration from what you're paying taxes on. The T's: world building trap, the trouble with tropes. And as always, make sure to go to gardul.com. That's GARDUL.com for the show notes. It'll be under podcasting, World Builders Anvil. That's a great place to get all of the information from the episode that you've just listened to, and to see all the resources that we've talked about in this episode. Thanks for joining us this episode of the World Builders Anvil. Please be sure to rate and review us in iTunes, and please help get the word out to your friends about our show. And join me, Jeffrey W. Ingram at gardul.com, to see the progress of my world and learn why I made the choices I did. And please contact me and let me know the topics you would love to hear in the future. Now strike, while the myth rolls high.